香辣鸡翅也买2送1啦。
Non-political nature. Many Buddhists there. So since they asked me, you see, it is my moral responsibility to accept to go there.
The Dalai Lama was invited by Taiwan's opposition Democratic Progressive Party to comfort victims of Typhoon Morakot, which devastated parts of the island in early August. He will be visiting Kaohsiung tomorrow at the start of a 5-day stay. Fighting has eased along the China-Myanmar border. Some of those who fled northeastern Myanmar to China's Yunnan province following clashes between government troops and ethnic militiamen have reportedly begun to return home. As many as 30,000 people might have been temporarily displaced by the fighting between Myanmar troops and militiamen in the Kokang ethnic enclave. Violence flared after Myanmar soldiers were deployed in the area earlier this month in an attempt to assert control over Kokang, which for years has been run by an armed ethnic Chinese militia. Some of the militiamen who crossed the border have reportedly turned over their weapons to Chinese authorities. One Chinese official says there have been no reports of violence along the border area since last night. China has told Myanmar to end the fighting and maintain stability in the border region.
U.S. Senator Edward Kennedy has been buried after 4 days of emotional tributes the United States would normally reserve for a former president. Police said 50,000 people came to a 2-day public viewing of his casket at the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum in Boston. Kennedy was also eulogized by a sitting president at a funeral mass attended by 3 former ones. His body was then flown to Washington and traveled to the U.S. Capitol before going to its final resting place, Arlington National Cemetery. James LaGilia reports.
America's political elite packed the Roman Catholic Church in Boston to bid farewell to the man called the Lion of the Senate, Edward Moore Kennedy. Kennedy's coffin was borne by a military honor guard into the place of worship. The Stars and Stripes flag was taken from Kennedy's casket and folded. Kennedy's widow, Victoria Reggie, his sole surviving sibling, Jean Kennedy Smith, and Robert F. Kennedy's widow, Ethel, carefully arranged a cloth funeral pall atop the coffin. The 2-hour service was filled with music by Yo-Yo Ma and tenor Placido Domingo celebrating a great life.
I pray today that we can set aside this sadness and instead celebrate all that he was and did and stood for.
U.S. President Barack Obama gave the eulogy and bestowed a compliment humbling even for a Kennedy.
He was a product of an age when the joy and nobility of politics prevented differences of party, platform, and philosophy from becoming barriers to cooperation and mutual respect. A time when adversaries still saw each other as patriots. And that's how Ted Kennedy became the greatest legislator of our time.
Morning rain continued to beat down steadily as Kennedy's coffin was brought back out for the flight to Washington. Hundreds lined nearby sidewalks ignoring the rain as the funeral procession passed. In Washington, the motorcade stopped for a brief prayer service outside the U.S. Capitol, where lawmakers from both political parties, staffers from Kennedy's 47 years in the Senate, and hundreds of others were waiting. They sang patriotic songs.
Officials have sent up to 30,000 refugees across the border into Yunnan province. Arthur Keller reports.
After fighting broke out between Myanmar's government soldiers and ethnic Han Chinese rebels from the Kokang area and the northeastern Shan state, thousands have been spilling across the border into China's southwest Yunnan province. We cannot say we fled. We were humiliated. So many innocent people were being killed, said this militiaman. Many of the ethnic Han Chinese rebels living in Myanmar have sought refuge across the border, living in tents at a refugee camp. They were told to wear the blue overalls of Chinese government troops before crossing into the town of Nansan. But it's not just soldiers among the 30,000 refugees estimated by the UN Refugee Agency to have fled the fighting. This worker who escaped said people were afraid of war, so they fled to take shelter and hoped to go back home after the fighting ends. Dozens of people caught in the violence had been admitted to Zhenkang County People's Hospital, and it was reported that one person died and several others were injured when a bomb was thrown across the border into China. The Washington-based concern group Campaign for Burma has said the majority of the ethnic militia fighting against the government had surrendered to China, but didn't confirm whether their leader Peng Jiasheng was among them. Officials in Yunnan said many of the refugees had already started to return home. It's the type of violence that Beijing has been trying to avoid, with the 60th anniversary of the People's Republic of China just around the corner. Beijing has urged Myanmar to stop the fighting to safeguard regional stability. The violence threatens to strain the traditionally warm relations between Beijing and Myanmar's military government, which is trying to take control over armed ethnic groups in the run-up to next year's national elections, the first in 2 decades. Arthur Akiola, ATV News.
Still ahead on ATV's main news tonight, National Day rehearsals in Beijing showcase China's military might.
Senator Ted Kennedy buried in Washington after final farewell.
Macau.
Beijing has ended 2 days of dress rehearsals for China's National Day celebrations, which are expected to be huge this year.
The practice session for the military parade finished this morning, giving an indication of what will be on display in October. Another sneak peek at China's preparations for the big show on the 1st of October, this time the military side. Overnight at Tiananmen Square in Beijing, a second dress rehearsal was held for National Day, when the country celebrates 60 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China. Every decade, the showcase of the mainland's military prowess features thousands of marching soldiers from the infantry, navy, and air force. Perfectly synchronized, they're the symbol of China's new status as one of today's superpowers after 3 decades of extraordinary economic growth. This year's parade will involve more weapons and hardware than ever before, and it'll give the world a glimpse at China's most modern military equipment. Most of it will be showcased proudly as homegrown technology. The celebrations will not only show off what the nation is capable of, but cement what most people already knew, that China is a political, economic, and military force to watch out for. Overseas again, Edward Kennedy, one of the longest-serving and most influential U.S. senators, has been buried in Washington alongside his famous brothers.
Thousands of people lined the streets of Washington to say goodbye, and also Boston, where his memorial service was held earlier. Ben O'Rourke reports.
Politicians and presidents past and present mingled with Hollywood stars and other notables for the funeral service of Massachusetts Senator Edward Kennedy. Outside the Basilica in Boston, around 50,000 mourners gathered to get a last look at Kennedy's coffin. There have been numerous memorials since his death on Tuesday from brain cancer, and his passing is being treated as if he were president. His early career was overshadowed by the lives and assassinations of his brothers, President John F. and Senator Robert, in the 1960s, and his own bid for the presidency was largely ruined by his failure to report a fatal car accident and subsequent attempts by his family to cover it up. However, later in life, he overcame personal scandals to redeem himself and earn a reputation as a champion for the common man.
Thinking back on all the memories of everything that Senator Kennedy has done for our state and for our nation, thinking also a little bit of some of the bad times that have affected that entire family. That's pretty tragic.
Back inside, US President Barack Obama had some words to say about Kennedy, who was one of his biggest supporters during his election campaign.
He was a product of an age when the joy and nobility of politics prevented differences of party, platform, and philosophy from becoming barriers to cooperation and mutual respect. A time when adversaries still saw each other as patriots. And that's how Ted Kennedy became the greatest legislator of our time.
After the service, the coffin was flown to Washington, where it was driven through the city to Arlington National Cemetery. On the way, it stopped one last time outside the Senate, where he served for 47 years.
And I did a lot of work on Capitol Hill, and he was one of the few senators you would see in the hall. You could stop and say, "Good morning, Senator Kennedy." He'd stop and extend his hand. He always had time for the ordinary individual.
Kennedy's grave is on a Virginia hillside, flanked by maple trees. His brother Robert lies 30 meters away, and it's another 30 meters to the eternal flame that has burned since 1963 for John after he was assassinated.